I am Charlene Margot, co-founder of nonprofit The Parent Venture. We are delighted to have with us tonight Scott Shigeoka, who's going to be talking to you about his new book, Seek: How Curiosity can change your life and transform the world. Nope, can transform your life and change the world. Please join me in a really warm welcome for tonight's speaker, Scott Shigeoka. Take it away, Scott.
Thanks so much, Helene. And I'm so grateful to be here. And I always like to start by, especially on Zoom, it's really nice to get some interactivity going. And there's a chat function at the bottom of your screen. And I wanted to just ask each of you, what is an example of a powerful question that you've been asked recently? What is an example of a powerful question that you have been asked recently? And to, write that in the chat. So for me, for example, one that came up when I was talking to a dear friend is, when do you know when you have enough? Another deep question that's simpler, but also was deeply provoking, that our family just asked answered as a family sharing question around the table was, what are you grateful for in your life right now? What are you grateful for? And whether that's through your workplace, through your schools, through your experience with your kids, your friends, your family, I would love to hear, what is a question that feels really powerful to you that you've been asked recently, or even something that comes to mind. So I'm seeing from Amy, what is your purpose in life? That's a really juicy one. I love this one, Stephanie, too. What brings you joy? This is from Susan. What's important to you as I'm seeking a possible job change? That's really, yeah, really nice one too. What does it mean to be a good parent? What is keeping you up at night? I really love these. And if you could continue to share the questions that come up for you, then we'll have what I call a powerful questions bank. I even in my iPhone on my notes app, I collect all of the wonderful questions that come up in a day and in a life. As a culture, we focus so much on the answers that we're looking for, whether that's in school, in our workplaces, at home. But our questions that we're asking and that we're asking each other or even asking ourselves are just as important. So before I jump into the keynote today, I wanted to actually lead a mindfulness practice that I would like to invite you to join. This is totally opt-in. So, if you feel comfortable, please do join me. I think it's going to be a really powerful exercise. And then I'll get started with the talk. So for this mindfulness exercise, if you can just sit in a comfortable position and close your eyes, or you can hold a soft gaze. And we'll start by taking a deep breath in through our nose and exhaling through our mouth. Take another deep breath in through our nose, feeling our shoulders rise, stomach expand, and exhale through your mouth. And as you find your normal or even a slower pace of breathing, I want you to think about this question. Who is someone in your life, one person, who has been curious towards you? And because they were curious about you, that made you feel seen, heard, like you mattered? Who is one person that has shown you curiosity and made you feel like you mattered? And this might be someone that's really close to you, a partner, child, a parent, a family member, a friend, a colleague, a neighbor, or it could be someone that you have not as strong of a tie to. Maybe the barista or a stranger or a friend or acquaintance you're not as close with. But who is one person that's shown you curiosity and made you feel like you mattered? We're just going to take a second to honor that person. Then we're going to take another deep inhale through our nose. and out their mouth. And gently come back into awareness. Thank you so much for joining me on that. I would also love for you to do the chat, use the chat function and write the first name of that person that came up for you in that mindfulness practice. So I'll get that started. And I just want to use this opportunity as a moment to honor all of these individuals who aren't necessarily in the room with us today, who use their curiosity to make us feel seen, to make us feel heard, to make us feel like they mattered. So, you know, whoever that is, let's bring them into the room by adding their first name, or a description of them is totally okay as well, like Lenny used. So we have Diane, Jenny, my therapist, Brittany, Anna, Amy, David, MC, Francesco, Jay-Z, Jenny, so many more names I'm sure will continue to pop up, but that in and of itself is such a beautiful reminder for me. I love this activity because it shows us that there are so many people, even outside of the rooms that we're in, that have made an impact on every single person who is there. And that is one place of curiosity that we can always start with. I'm going to start off this conversation by actually sharing a personal story, a story that dates all the way back to 2017, which is almost a decade ago, when I was in Joshua Tree and I started to hear voices. And these auditory hallucinations, they were voices that shared really nasty things to me. They said, "You're unworthy of love." They said, "You're a freak." They told me things that made me feel really horrible about myself. And they lasted for days, and then weeks, and then months. And like most people, I tried to push them away at first. I tried to dismiss them. But the more that I did that, the stronger and louder the voices would become. And so, like any good millennial, I guess you could say, I went to my therapist, who I should have also put in this chat box as well, who asked me a really interesting question. He said, "Have you ever tried getting curious about what those voices are saying?" And that was a really scary moment for me. That was a clutch your pearls kind of moment for me, is what I would say, because I was sort of shocked that my therapist asked me to get curious about the very thing that I feared. But he had always led me to growth and to compassion and understanding. And so I decided to follow his advice. And the next time that the voices came, I started to really listen. I started to get really curious to see what they were actually saying. And what I realized is that they mirrored what I had heard as a young child, or what I had told myself as a child, especially when I was bullied or grappling, with my sexuality, or working through all of the things that I went through as a child that I had forgotten. And slowly through this process of actually being open and curious and listening to those voices, I started to see this younger version of myself that was inside of me, that was yearning for attention and for connection. And I started to realize that curiosity allowed me to not only move through this fear that I was experiencing around my auditory hallucinations, but it allowed me to truly heal. And that taught me a lot about the work that I also do, surprisingly. I work at UC Berkeley's Greater Good Science Center. A lot of what we do is we spread research-based practices that help us to do things like love better, to be more compassionate, to sink into gratitude, to experience awe, to be curious, which is a lot of my focus. Basically, how can we, really lean into the best parts of our humanity? And what I've learned through all of these years of my work is that in this moment, what I call the era of incuriosity, a moment when we are turning away from one another. And I see this a lot in schools because I travel to schools all across this country, both K through 12 and universities. Um, we're in this moment where people are being canceled, where people are being dismissed for their differences in what seem to be different ideologies, or for an identity that seems to clash with their own. And what I've learned in this era of incuriosity, where there's so much division and disconnection, one tactic or practice that we can use to help us navigate this time, and something that I've seen that really works, because months later I'll hear from students or teachers or parents or faculty about how much it works, is us practicing curiosity. Curiosity really being this desire for us to understand. How do we understand one another in a deeper way? How do I understand myself in a deeper way? How do I practice curiosity? And I want to expand our definition of curiosity. I think we often think about it in this more intellectual frame, as an intellectual exercise. I want to learn something, so I'll listen to a podcast, I'll listen to the daily or the journal, or I'll read a book, or I'll read the news. But that's only one aspect of curiosity. A lot of my work around curiosity is bringing it from the mind down into the heart. And I call that heart-centered curiosity. In other words, how do we use curiosity as a force for connection, a connection towards others, or even towards ourselves, like I had mentioned with the story of our voices, my voices. And so I wanted to really practice this, not just as someone who, I, like Charlene had mentioned, I am, on faculty at the University of Texas at Austin, and I also, work at UC Berkeley's Greater Good Science Center. But I also wanted to get out of these academic institutions and get out into the country and really start to practice curiosity through a lived way, to really have these lived experiences, to see whether the research that I was learning about would actually come true had I practiced it out in the world. So I packed up my Prius, my Toyota Prius. I took out the back seats of my Toyota Prius and put out a bed. And it was basically like van life, but with a lot less height clearance. And I traveled across the country, across the United States, as a queer, progressive, Asian American person who spent most of my adult life in the San Francisco Bay Area. I traveled to Trump rallies, and I traveled to meet with religious community leaders. And I lived in rural communities for months at a time. And the idea behind it was, could I actually practice my curiosity and move from fear of the other, this feeling of feeling threatened and feeling afraid of people who I deemed as the other? And could I even learn to love them, just like I had with my voices? Could I learn to heal? Could I learn to connect in a way that I hadn't ever before, using more of a practice of dismissal and ignoring? Could I move away from that towards curiosity and understanding? And so I want to share two stories from that trip. There's many, many more stories from that trip in Seek, in my book, but I'm going to share two that I think are really powerful. And then I want to provide an invitation that I think is really powerful, especially for parents. I think, it's something that you're going to want to hear. So I'll end with that. But the first story I want to share is really a fascinating story, because it's with Catholic sisters. And I did not grow up Catholic, but I was able to, go to a convent and meet a group of women religious, of Catholic sisters, who are living with a group of millennials. Millennials who weren't Catholic, millennials who were spiritually diverse. It was a part of a program called Nuns and Nuns. Nuns and NONES. It's an incredible program, and it started with this residency. And Nuns and Nuns, they explored all kinds of really wonderful topics like spiritual practice and belonging, and what does it mean for us to come together intergenerationally. But they also talked about topics like the vows, the 3 vows that Catholic sisters take: the vow of chastity, the vow of poverty, and the vow of obedience. And one of the millennial residents that I met there, Sarah, had mentioned that she had carried a negative connotation about the word chastity in particular. She had connected chastity with this idea of a tool being used to exert power over women or to control their autonomy or their body. But Sarah's also an extremely curious person. And so she created these relationships with sisters, and she started asking all of these questions about the vow. And slowly, what began to happen was her assumptions and her bias that she initially had, or her initial understanding of the definition of chastity, began to grow. It began to expand. And she started to see it as something anew. And so now Sarah sees the vow of chastity as what she calls the deprivatization of love, which I'm obsessed with. I think it's such a great terminology. I even told her, I was like, you need to do a TED Talk on this. The deprivatization of love. In other words, when women religious take this vow of chastity to her, she sees it as an opportunity to spread care and love beyond an immediate partner, beyond a family, into a community, into even a group of millennials who arrived at a doorstep of a convent in a Subaru to share in a more abundant way. And she drew a connection between the vow of chastity and queerness, how we think differently about love and family structures, and that, wow, maybe even though we're very different, there is actually a lot that we share. There is this more common humanity that we have at the heart of our values and the ways in which we live our life. But the most beautiful part, really, of Sarah's story, I think, is she now works at this incredible organization called Land Justice Futures. And they're thinking about, what do we do about the land that we've loved for generations? And she now works with religious communities like Catholic Sisters, who, the Catholic Church is a major institution that owns lots of land, in thinking about, how do we root racial and ecological justice into land justice and land transfer. And it's such a beautiful example of how curiosity isn't just about us trying to intellectually grow and exercise our minds and learn new things. And it's not even just about connection, like the ones that she made with the sisters. It's also a vehicle for creating real change. It actually led her to a place of purpose. That was one of the questions that came up in the Zoom chat. What is a purpose, or what is my purpose? It actually helped her to arrive at that understanding of what her purpose is right now and what she's dedicating her life to right now. And so I love that story of Sarah. I love that story of the Catholic sisters and nuns and nuns. And I wanted to share that today because the emerging research in the field of psychology shows a lot about how we can counter our assumptions and interrupt our biases and remove our strong grasp around certainty when we embrace curiosity. And I think that this is such a great model for us as parents, and also as we think about our schools, where we want our children and we want students to, really challenge the assumptions that they're holding, to not jump to conclusions or judgments, but to instead move from that reactive place to a more curious one, to really understand in a deeper way, and to recognize that, there is so much more that we can learn. So that's the first story that I wanted to share, and I thought that was a really beautiful one. The second one is about my trip to a Trump rally in Minnesota. I remember going there and I saw the sea of red, and it was a group of people that were voting in a very different way than I was. And I went up to different individuals who were there, and I, share. In Hawaii, I'm from Hawaii. We say I talk story. So we talk story. We basically shared, who we were, upbringings, hobbies, what we're interested in, and we were connecting in more of that shallow and surface way. And then something really interesting happened. When I started asking them all of these questions about who they were, they started to turn the table and ask me questions about who I was. And I want to say that I was wearing a very particularly fabulous outfit that day, not unlike the one that I'm wearing today. I have an incredible closet. And I'm saying that because I did not hide or erase or flatten any of the identities that make me me. For example, my queerness. And I shared what it meant for me to be queer. I shared the rising and felt transphobia and even homophobia that is existing in our country still to this day. And, I had just 2 weeks before going to that rally, I had been intimidated and physically threatened by a group of men because of my sexuality and the way that I present. And so, I think it was this beautiful reminder of what emerging psychology research is sharing, that when we are in an environment that sort of uplifts curiosity, or in other words, when someone is being curious towards us and is asking us questions and is genuinely interested in who we are, it is much more likely for them to return that towards us, for them to also get curious about us. It doesn't happen all the time. It's not a guarantee, but it is much more likely that someone is going to be curious about your own identities, perspectives, values, and experiences firsthand if you are curious towards them than if you are trying to take them down, or if you're judging them, or if you're doing something that might close them off or want to put a distance or become defensive. And I think that's a really important strategy that even clinicians use in places like marriage and family therapy, right? When we want to move from reactivity to a place of curiosity, it's really helpful to move away from judgment and instead come from this place of wanting to understand the person that is in front of you before even sharing your own point of view. The other piece that I thought was really powerful about that experience of the Trump rally was my perception of who a Trump voter was at that time began to really shift and change. I did what many people naturally do with any group, which is that we sometimes see a group of people as a monolithic sort of entity where everyone who is Asian or everyone who is Republican, or everyone who is gay, or everyone who is 42, or everyone who lives in the San Francisco Bay Area. They all must be the same. They all must be X like X. But as we know, that is just not true. There is such a spectrum of individuality. You can share the same identity as someone else and be a completely different person. No two Christians are the same. No two queer men are the same, as examples. And so what happened was that me going to this rally and coming from a place of curiosity allowed me to see more individuality. And what we know from the psychological research is that when we see individuality instead of the group identity, we feel less threatened about people we deem as the other or who we deem as different from us. And when we feel less threatened, when we feel less fear, it is so much more conducive for us to come together and to actually have conversations or engage in conflict that's healthy, that allows us to move forward together. The invitation that I think is really important for us as parents and working with children or having children, because that shows up in many different ways for many of the folks who are on this call and who are going to watch this recording, I'm sure. But we're all unified by this idea of wanting to support one another and also wanting to support children and the students of today. And I think at the base of the work that I've been doing is really a lesson about love. And I'm really excited to drop the L word here on the Parent Venture webinar, because I think it's really important. I think love is really an undercurrent for what we're all trying to do here. And I've always heard that adage, love is a verb. Love is a verb, but I've always wondered, what is the verb? How do we actually do it? What's the action behind loving? And what I've learned through, the story of my voices and even the journey I did across the country and the years that I've spent researching and dedicated to curiosity, I've learned that the best idea for how we can love one another better is for us to practice curiosity. Because when we practice curiosity, what we say and what we do is we turn to someone and we say, I want to know who you are. Whether that's our children, whether that's a fellow parent, I want to know who you are. I want to know your story. I want to know your nuances. I want to know what excites you. I want to know all the things that you all asked in the question exercise at the beginning of this call. And I want to know all these things about you, not because I want to fix you or because I want to mold you into who I think you should be, or not because I want to change anything about you. I simply want to know because I want to care about you. I love you. I want to see you. I want to hear you because you matter to me. The practice of curiosity in that way is really about love. And I think that that is one of the most beautiful things that we can do as parents. One of the most beautiful things we can do to support children and students today is to practice love with them, to create an environment where they feel loved and they feel like they matter. And one of the best ways we can do that is through curiosity. There's so many different ways for us to practice curiosity as a force for love. I like to say that curiosity is on a spectrum and it goes from shallow to deep. And so many of us stick to the shallow side and we ask questions like, oh, what's your name? Or like, oh, how, what subjects are you taking? Or, where do you live? Or, if we're talking to fellow parents or, kids. And that's great. It helps us to better understand, who someone is and get bits of information. But there's also this whole other part of the spectrum of curiosity called deep curiosity, which is all about how do we dive underneath the surface and really see the person that is in front of us. I like to say deep curiosity allows us to penetrate the layers of a person and reach their soul. So it's really soulful work. It's a soulful practice. And when we use deep curiosity, the quality of our questions change. It's like many of the questions that you put into the Zoom chat. Instead of what is your name, I might ask, what's the story of your name? Where does it come from? Why were you named that? Or is there a cultural or family connection to that? I would love to learn the story of your name. Instead of, where do you live? It might be, what does home mean to you? How do you feel safe in a home? What environment do you like to be in when it comes to a home? What people come to mind when you think of home? Instead of where do you work or what do you study or, what subjects do you take or how was school today? What really excited you about your day today? What was really challenging? What's troubling you at school or, with your week today? The quality of our questions change and therefore the responses also change with it. And that is deep curiosity. And that allows us to create the kinds of connections and the transformation that I think we are all looking for. The other piece that I think is really important for us to remember is that curiosity is earned, it is not deserved. And so as much as we're like craving that from our children or from fellow parents, and we have all of these questions we want to ask them, it does not mean that we will automatically get it. Or in other words, if we are curious about someone's hair, about their culture, about, something related to their health or something about, whether they're pregnant or not, whatever curiosities you have, it does not mean you are entitled to the privilege of that information. And the reason is that curiosity requires trust and a relationship. If you don't have that trust, if you don't have that relationship, then you won't necessarily get the responses that you're hoping for. But the more and more that you can create that, the more likely it is that people will be willing to actually respond to your curiosity. And then the final thing I wanted to say before we go into Q&A, and I would really love to hear any of your reactions and comments and questions. You can throw them into the Zoom chat and want to get through as many as we can. Is that curiosity is a muscle. And so, I hear from a lot of parents who want to forge a deeper connection with their children or, help them become more curious out in the world or in their lives. It takes time. It's really like any other muscle that's in our body. When we go to the gym and we do strength training, we don't automatically jump into like 300-pound, bench press, right? We have to really take our time, work our way up towards, stronger and stronger muscle building and practices. And we do that not just because it's the right thing to do, but also because it's a safe thing to do. I can't expect that someone who is newer on their curiosity journey is going to go to the political rally of an opposing party. Like that's not something that might be safe or like the right thing for them to do. You start small and you work your way up and you build these muscles of curiosity. But that said, there's also that saying that the heaviest weight in the gym is the front door. The heaviest weight in the gym is the front door. In other words, sometimes it is the motivation and our desire to get started that is the hardest part for us to overcome. And that is true of strength building and building our muscles and our body, but that is also true of curiosity. That for our children and for the people around us, as much as we want them to practice curiosity, there are things that might get in the way. I call them speed bumps of curiosity. I write about that in the book. And we have to have grace and a lot of compassion in this process of really creating the conditions for people to practice and exercise their curiosity. and to have faith that they will feel the pleasure of curiosity when they begin to practice it. And that's actually a true statement. It's not just something that I intuitively think. When researchers have put people under fMRIs and research what happens inside of someone's brain when you're, practicing curiosity, what they found is that uh, there's a neurotransmitter called dopamine that is heavily associated with curiosity. And dopamine, if you do not know, is sometimes called the happy hormone. And it's the same neurotransmitter that's connected to when we eat a tasty meal, or when we have sex, or when we win an award. Those are all things that are, helpful for our survival. Those are things that our brain wants us to incentivize so that we can do more and more. We derive pleasure from it, and it's something that provides some kind of health or well-being benefit for us. Or in, winning an award, that helps us to have kinship and, a connection to, a greater group, which also provides protection. So curiosity does the same thing. When we practice curiosity, we actually are seeing that dopamine is something that's associated to it, and it feels good. So trust that when your kids get curious, when you get curious, when fellow parents get curious, and they get through that big barrier of the front door, the heaviest weight, that they will continue to be motivated and incentivized to be curious, because it'll feel good, it'll be fun, and it'll be something that'll be really enriching and engaging for them. But I really want to end on that point, that the biggest promise of curiosity is really how it can help us to love one another better, not just our children, but everyone that wraps around our children, to provide them the lives of enrichment that we're all hoping for, whether that's our peers, our parents, fellow parents, our family, our friends. The more and more that we can model curiosity as a culture, whether that's a culture in a family or a culture in a community, the more likely it is that children and others will follow suit too. So I'm going to sort of stop it there. I'm going to open it up for questions. But I just wanted to thank you all so much for listening in, for sharing your questions on the Zoom chat, for doing the mindfulness exercise, for listening to the stories of the road trip and hearing some of this science-backed research about curiosity. And then you can place your questions that you have in the chat. There was a couple up top, actually, that I just wanted to address before we jumped in. But please, write any questions or comments, or even things that you're really struggling with around curiosity, or things that you want to learn about curiosity in the chat. There was one thing that I thought was really powerful here, which is what is your limit, or what is holding you back? That was a question that Lenny and I feel Relly, I hope I'm saying your name right. Please let me know if I'm not. What that made me sort of remember about curiosity is that not all curiosity is the same. There is sometimes bad curiosity, and I call that predatory curiosity. There was actually a New York Times article that just came out that where I was interviewed, and I talked about this concept, and it went viral because I think a lot of folks, especially parents and folks in many of the environments we're working in, and even in our families, they really felt resonant. And predatory curiosity is when someone looks like they're being curious, they're asking questions, they're leaning in, they're very open-ended, and their nonverbals are really demonstrating that. But there's an ulterior motive underneath it. There's an agenda underneath their questions. They're asking you a question so that they can have a gotcha moment, or they're I'll use the example of my adult parent who asked me for the 20th time, like, why am I not having kids? It doesn't come from a desire of wanting to understand the perspective of the person that is in front of you. It comes from a place of wanting to sometimes share your own point of view, maybe even fears or concerns you have, and the emotions that you're projecting on someone else. But it is not true curiosity, because it is not about understanding the person who is in front of you. It is not about that open-hearted, open-minded, I do not know what I'm about to encounter here, but I'm here to listen. So I'll share that, and yeah, we'll open it up to questions. But Charlene, do you have any questions to kick us off, or Cynthia?
Yeah,
Or...
I do. These are some that we have heard in the past from parents, and things that we just kind of want to know more about. But everybody, do feel free to put your questions in the chat like Scott suggested, or the Q&A box, either works. And maybe you'll be able to go back, Scott, to some of those ones. For
Yeah.
example, I was thinking, I've been going through a health challenge. And when
Mm.
it first started, I got so many questions and so many questions. And I realized that you get to a point where you don't want to answer every question. It can be a little predatory because people are just they want to know more stuff, but they didn't really want to know about me.
Yeah.
You
Yeah.
comment on that because they're like, how do you shut that down?
Yeah. 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 And I think, I think the first thing is to, I think there's so many ways to approach this, but one of the things that I really practice is really getting curious about where they're coming from. Might they be asking that question? What is underneath that? The other piece is, there are different directions to curiosity. So I've been talking a lot about outward curiosity, but there's also inward curiosity, really looking at ourselves, getting curious about our own emotions, our needs, our wants, and importantly, our boundaries. And when we have that inward curiosity and we think about our boundaries and we uphold them, that's also a really powerful way to, to at least let folks know that these questions aren't appreciated or they're feeling invasive or you feel that they're not coming from a place of really wanting to understand or support you based on where you're coming from. But I think the other piece, and I write about this in the book, is to have grace. That sometimes folks are really trying to be curious and their intention is just to want to understand, but we might not be in a place of having the energy reservoir to answer that, or, we have a lot of other things going on. And so to have a lot of grace towards the people who are asking questions, to know that sometimes it's coming from a really good place, but, there's a misalignment in, our energy or our dynamic at the moment. And then also self-compassion. If you are the question asker and you're asking a question to someone else and it just doesn't really land, to remember, that, hey, you are on this journey, you're practicing, exercising that muscle, and that's a part of the journey too.
So, Scott, you write about that the opposite of fear is curiosity. Can you say more about that and why you see those as opposites?
Yeah, and there's a couple of ones in the Q&A that are popping up, so we can definitely
You,
get to those as
you,
well.
you go
Um,
ahead.
oh, no,
Go.
no. Yeah, so so this first one is uh, any advice for a child who is attempting to use more curiosity in their relationship, however, the other person is not in the same frame of mind and shut them down? Yeah. Okay, and there's a lot more coming in. Okay,
Coming in.
so yeah, so that's a great question, and something that I actually hear about quite a lot. I think that there's a couple of things that I would share here. One is there's different forms of reciprocity, and I think it's important to remind the child of that. So what do I mean by that? So there's specific reciprocity, which is I ask a question to my really, I'm gonna guess this is a romantic relationship, to my partner. And then they ask me a question back, right? I go to a rally and I ask someone a question and they ask me a question back. That is specific reciprocity. But there's also generalized, oh, parent-child relationship. Great. I asked a question to my child and then the child asked me a question back. So that is specific reciprocity. But there's also generalized reciprocity. So what that means is I ask, my child a question, they ask their friends a question, and it goes all the way around. And then maybe one day, my partner or my parent or my family member or my friend or colleague asks me a question. So in other words, we're both getting our needs of curiosity met, but not from one another. And one is not better than the other, but I think it's just important to expand our understanding of reciprocity because many people will stay on the side of specific. And if you're not giving me curiosity, then why should I give you curiosity when it can be much more expansive than that? And then the other piece that I think is really powerful is there are sometimes subtle ways in the parent-child relationship where we are being incurious without us even knowing. And so an example of that is, say your child comes back from speech and debate practice or from a soccer game or speech and debate tournament. And they're like, oh my gosh, like I totally failed. I sucked at that. That like wasn't great. And our response might be like, no, what are you talking about? Like you did great. You like won a couple of like rounds. You got that pass. You made that goal. Like, I don't like you saying those kinds of things about yourself. Like you did not fail. And what's happening in that situation is a child is saying, here's my worldview. Here's how I feel. about the experience I had at this tournament or at this game. And then this parent or this adult figure is saying something contradictory, is
Yeah.
saying, that's not right, that's not true. And actually, here's what you should feel. Here's what you should feel instead. Here's how you should think about it instead. When instead, a script that I have in the book and what I talk about is, I don't think you failed, but can you tell me more about why you feel that way? And tell me more is like a really powerful phrase to just have in your back pocket always. Whenever you're like, I don't know how to be curious in this moment, tell me more is a great phrase to remember. And what that does is by you saying, I don't think you failed, but tell me more about why you think you did, it opens the door for more curiosity and for more connection. And this child now, in their own words, processing, reflecting actively, and now authoring their own narrative about how they feel, they get to share why it is that they feel that way. It's an invitation for them. And what you might learn is like, whoa, my definition of failure is catastrophic. But their definition is like Carol Dweck, like growth mindset, like they're all about like growing and challenging themselves, and it's not as catastrophic as you thought it was. Or maybe you hear that they have this negative self-talk voice and it's really strong. But instead of you just assuming that and telling them that that's what's happening, they're telling that to you in their own words. So that's like a great example. There's so many other examples of how we as parents are subtly sometimes, being incurious when we don't want to be. Like the intention of saying like, no, you did a good job might be encouragement and wanting to support our children and show them love and help them to form great habits of self-image and self-talk and all these things that are important. But sometimes they can close the door on curiosity and on connection.
Yeah, because the child felt shut down. Whereas that question that you started with today, who made you feel seen by
Yeah.
being curious about you? I think that would work really well with our kids too.
Yeah, absolutely.
All right,
Um,
here, oh,
yeah,
I'm
go
sorry,
ahead.
go
Go ahead.
ahead.
Go ahead. Yeah,
I'm
go
just,
ahead.
here's a question. If you could solve this, this would really help, Scott. How can parents of teen boys exhibit curiosity in ways that are comfortable for them? Mine have little interest in sharing. Many of my well-intentioned questions, like what would be good for dinner, are often met with one-word responses. We hear this a lot from parents of teen boys.
Mhm. Yeah, well, I think one thing to remember is it's a great question, by the way. And one thing to remember is that questions are only one aspect of curiosity. The Gottmans are researchers, and they talk a lot about this idea of a bid for attention. And they're happening all the time around us, but we sometimes are not aware of them or know that they're happening. So your teen boy or teenagers at home might say, oh my gosh, like I really love this new skin that I just got in this game. Or, oh my gosh, I heard this really interesting joke or funny joke, from my friend, and so they're saying things out loud, which sometimes we just sort of let pass us by, and
Right.
what's happening in that moment is it's a bid for attention that's being shared that we're not meeting, that we're not sort of affirming. And what the Gottmans have found, and some folks might know about this research, and this is true not just in romantic relationships, but in all relationships, which include parent-child, is that you can actually, it is much more likely that when you are responding to the bids of attention that others are giving to you, it is much more likely that they will be more fulfilling and longer lasting relationships. So the more and more that you can recognize when these bids for attention are happening, and they happen all the time. Oh, what do you want for dinner? Isn't a great example of a bid for attention. Or, oh, I just read this really cool line, or like, check out that really sick car, that just drove past us. It might be things that we're not interested in at all, that our partners or our children are saying, but they are bids for our attention. And when we respond to them, we're like, oh my gosh, like, what do you like about that car? Or like, what kind of skin did you get? Can you show me? That's how you start to build this muscle of curiosity in the dynamic, but also for them, and also for you. And so I think that's like a really interesting piece of research. The other form that's not questions that, I mean, is just a great thing to think about. There's sports psychologists like Alan Richardson, who found that when you visualize, if you have two different groups, and one is just visualizing every day themselves throwing a free throw at the free throw line, free throw basketball for 20 days, for 20 minutes a day, they will shoot just as many free throws successfully and improve their performance just as much as someone who's actually practicing throwing free throws for 20 minutes a day. And this is also called mental rehearsal. It's something really big in sports psychology. We just had the Olympics. A lot of elite performers and their coaches will actually take people through mental rehearsal and through visualizations. You might see them closing their eyes as they're envisioning their floor routine, if they're in gymnastics. This has been replicated across many, many sports. It's also true in business performance, but it's also true in our parent performance and in the ways that we are with children. But we sometimes don't visualize in the same way that we would with, sports or with a one-on-one or a feedback session we're going to have, with a team member. But we can do the same thing when we think about a dinner that we're going to share with our children. What are the kinds of questions we're going to ask? What are the ways that we're going to come in with intentionality? Where is the dinner happening? Is that a place that is conducive for curiosity for us? Or are we trying to ask questions, in really hectic, rush hour traffic as we're going to and from school when we're not facing each other and someone's on the phone? And, so it's about bringing more intentionality, and that's what visualization and mental rehearsal can do. It increases the likelihood of our performance succeeding because we're much more prepared for it. So that's, another example of, it's not just about questions. There's so many other ways that we can practice and nurture curiosity. Also, using our hands and playing is a great example of being curious. We can be curious in tactile ways by exploring. For those of you in the Bay, the Exploratorium is a great example of tactile curiosity. Using your hands, playing, what are the other forms that, exercise curiosity beyond just dialogue, beyond just questions, because that doesn't work for everyone.
All right. Thank you for those are really great suggestions, Scott. And it's hard to get those teen boys to open up. But as you say, if we can be aware of some of those bids for attention and respond in kind, right, maybe we'll do better. So this is a question from your comments around attending the Trump rally. She asked, what do you think about affinity spaces and how they might impact our ability to be curious and connect with those who are different from us?
Yeah. And I would love to learn more about affinity space. I'm trying to find that question. But I think I guess what I heard was, you know, and please correct me if I'm wrong, like please provide any more context if you can to whoever asked that question. But, how do we come together across our differences and be curious and connect? Is that, Charlene, do you think that's sort of what they were
Yeah,
asking?
I do.
Yeah. Well, first of all, these third spaces where we would normally intersect with people who are very different from us, for instance, religious spaces, are becoming less and less abundant. They're not as widely spread. We don't go to the YMCA anymore and like bump into people, or many of us don't. Even going to the grocery store doesn't happen as often as we're ordering things online and on our apps. So, these spaces, these third spaces where we can encounter people who are very different from us and actually be curious and connect are less and less available. Even when you think about what's called the age apartheid, right? I think something that I'm so grateful for is I had so many intergenerational teachers growing up as a child. And that is less and less the case as young people are in schools, and folks who are adults are in workplaces. And the fastest growing place on the U.S. Census was actually the villages in Florida. So senior living communities are really, really growing, which is also segregating people across age. And that's happening across so many identities, not just age, and that's called the age apartheid. And I think these spaces where people can come together and actually be curious and connect are so, so important. This is a great example of one, actually, the one that we're on today. There's so many. I'm seeing all the participants that are here, such a range of different voices and different perspectives. And and I hope that these kinds of spaces can also become very interactive, where folks can share, their firsthand experiences and stories, because that is how we really empathize and understand one another in a deeper way. The more that we can bring our children into those kinds of spaces as well, where they will be amongst people who are very different from them, and they will have their curiosity cultivated and nurtured versus killed, which unfortunately a lot of spaces are not very pro curiosity. So I think that is really, really important for us to really identify. And that isn't always like sports and clubs and things like that, which are very important as well, but they might just be one day experiences. It could be us taking our child to a cultural festival for an afternoon and exposing them to opportunities to connect with people who are much different from their own worldview or their own culture. So it's not things that need to cost money. It's not things that need to take a lot of time. How can we find these third spaces where we can encounter people who are very different from us, be curious, and forge these connections?
I think that's really important, Scott. We've heard advice like take your kid to a different town to get their hair cut. Go try a
Yeah,
restaurant with completely different food that's in Oakland, not in Palo Alto.
yeah.
Just there are things that parents can do that are intentional to move the needle, right, on those different shared spaces.
And there's more subtle things too, like do we take the same route from school to home? What does it look like to drive or walk or to stroll in a totally different way, right? We're so unfortunately controlled by many of these systems around us, like technology. But when you open Google Maps, it's not telling you the most scenic, the most interesting, the most culturally diverse path. It's telling you the most efficient. And so what's going to get you there fastest? And that's culturally, many of the spaces we're in are oriented around efficiency, but that's not necessarily the most curious way to live. And it's not necessarily the most engaging or way of feeling the most aliveness in our lives.
So, Scott, we obviously have a lot of parents that we see when we're doing these webinars. It is easy to see that spark of curiosity in a young child. And I know because Bev and I spent a lot of years teaching young children.
Yep.
It's a little harder when your child is a tween or a preteen. Any advice for keeping that spark going when your kids are older and it just is not quite as evident?
Yeah. And I actually I saw in the chat, oh, I didn't affinity groups. Got it. I think I just misheard the first question. So these are more about, groups where people of shared experiences or ancestry or ideologies can come together. And I think those are actually really important and powerful spaces to be because you want to, find spaces where you can connect with people who are similar to you, who have shared interests or shared identities. I think it's important to continue to cultivate those places. And it is also important that they don't become, like I was just mentioning, islands of segregation. It is also important to connect those spaces together and to ensure that people are meeting one another and are, learning and growing. And again, just because we share one identity doesn't mean we're same in all the other ways that, even within one affinity group, let's say it's an LGBTQ affinity group, there is a spectrum of diversity when it comes to many other identities and ideologies. So how can you encourage your children or, other students to really look for that, to remember that point about individuality, that there's a spectrum of diversity here in this affinity group. Thank you so much for clarifying that. And then remind me of what this last question was, Shirley.
Oh, that young children have that spark of curiosity. It may be shallow, but how do you keep that spark going when you have a tween or a
Yeah.
preteen who's giving you that kind of answer when you say, how was your school day?
Well, what's interesting is when you look at the meta-analysis of the research, so there was over 27 studies with over 1 million research participants. It's a lot of data. What they found is that we actually get more curious over our lifetime. And so there is this mythology, but it is a myth. It is not true. Just because it's in some book or you've heard it on some podcast does not mean it's real. It does not mean it's supported by empirical data. The data shows that it is not just young people who are curious. In fact, we get more curious over our lifespan up into cognitive decline. And what's beautiful, I have a council of curious elders because elders, how, they are just as curious, if not more curious than those who are 2, 3 generations below them. And the way in which we showcase our curiosity might change. The types of questions we might ask might change. The people we share our curiosities with might change, but it isn't only for the young. It isn't only for babies, even though we see the electricity of curiosity in their eyes when they're babbling, wow, oh, and they're really, if they're verbal, that's them really developing their communication, their language. And we see it in very obvious ways, but curiosity is not always obvious. So I want to dispel the myth that, our teens are not curious, they're actually extremely curious. And I think we have to acknowledge that, start from that place of acknowledgement that you are deeply curious. Even if I'm not seeing it, you are deeply curious. At least that is what the data is showing. And so to identify what are the ways that they're getting curious right now in their lives, maybe the way in which they're selecting their curiosity is not responding to the questions we're asking in dialogue. That's okay. But there might be other ways that they're getting really, really curious about themselves,
Mhm.
about their sexuality, about their identities, about their place in the world, about their purpose, about their emotions, about their friend groups, like all of those curiosities, or maybe the curiosity that they have of the world around them, the systems we're in, the ways in which that, they want to think about the future of our planet, whatever that is, they actually have much more curiosity than sometimes we give them. And so I want to dispel that mythology, like today.
Thank you. That really, really resonates, Scott. We work with Kendall Brogg, who researches purpose at Claremont.
Hmm.
And she said during the pandemic, they saw teens incredibly more interested in talking about finding purpose.
Yeah.
I thought that was really interesting that that would be like given a little time to think, they were very curious about their futures and that having them write about where they would be in 5 years was a really good exercise.
Yeah. Yeah. Absolutely. Yeah. I love Kendall, by the way. She's an amazing researcher. Yeah.
She is, isn't she? All right. Well, Scott, incredibly, this has been so much fun. We've learned so much, but we are coming to the end of our hour. So I want to end with one question that hopefully will resonate with you, and that is, what gives you hope about your effort to have a positive influence on inspiring others to seek transformation through deep curiosity? What gives you hope about your efforts?
It is all of the people who chose to be here today and who are also watching in the webinar because they couldn't be here today. I mean, I've met my team and I calculated like almost 100,000 people across the country in the last year on this journey of spreading Seek and the practices of curiosity. 100,000 people, and there are so many people across the country. And I've been across the country. I was just in Arkansas. I was just in Florida. I'm talking all across the country that want to bring curiosity to their schools, to their kids, to each other. And so, I think that seeing that common humanity is so uplifting, so inspiring. So thank you for showing up and for, devoting yourselves to these practices. And please don't hesitate to reach out if you have any questions or other, ways that you please get the book, Seek, but also, reach out personally. Like one of my favorite things about being an author is to connect with readers and hear their stories and answer their questions. Um,
Well, Scott, listen, the emojis are showing you. You've inspired us all tonight. We are so grateful to you. And we're so grateful to everybody who's been on with us and asked all these great questions and made all these nice comments. So, again, thank you, everybody, for a wonderful evening. And especially to you, Scott Shigeoka. And it sounds like congratulations might be in order.
oh yeah, for which part in my life?
You, for your personal self.
Oh
Yes?
yeah, 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 yeah. Well, I recently got engaged, so that was really great. Yeah,
Very exciting.
very, very
Well,
happy about that.
Scott,
Thanks, everybody.
we'll be looking for the TED Talk, okay?
Oh yes, that as well. And yeah, share any words or phrases that are coming up to you from watching this. Would love to hear it in the chat. And thanks you all so much. And thank you, Charlene. Thank you, Parent Venture, for making this happen.
Thank you, Scott. Thank you, everybody, for being with us. We'll see you again soon. Good night, everybody.